Hey everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion From Concept to Breaking Ground, a how-to guide to restoration. My name is Tyler Gooderly. I'm the fish biologist for the South Yuba River Citizens League, and I'll be the moderator of this discussion. We're hoping to have an engaging talk with lots of participation from the audience, so please don't be shy and ask questions. Again, if you're just joining, my name is Tyler Gooderly, and I'd like to thank you for coming to our discussion From Concept to Breaking Ground, a how-to guide to river restoration. With me here today is a distinguished panel of experts who have experience with several river restoration projects. We all work together on a SYRCL-led project called the Longbar Juvenile Salmonid Habitat Restoration Project. Without further ado, allow me to introduce the team. First up, we have Dr. Aaron Zettler-Mann, who is my boss and the Watershed Science Director here at SYRCL. Aaron is a geographer and a fluvial geomorphologist by training. His academic research is in developing cheap and accurate methods to make restoration monitoring more accessible. He's also an avid whitewater kayaker. Please welcome Aaron. Also with us today is Kirsten Selheim, Science Operations Manager and Senior Scientist for Kramer Fish Sciences. She's also my former boss. Kirsten focuses on how restoration affects the biological community, and she is an avid data analyst. Please welcome Kirsten. Next, we have Sam Diaz, who has a lot of letters after his name, which I think implies a lot of credentials, and I'm hoping we can discuss that at some point today. Sam is a Senior Ecoengineer II for CPESC Ecoengineering. His work focuses on the physical design of restoration. Literally, how many rocks are we moving? Please welcome Sam. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dale Pierce with us. Like the rest of the team, Dale has worn many hats and wears many hats still. He is a retired dentist and currently the president of a company managing lands with natural resource values along the Yuba and American rivers. His family has been involved in title insurance here in the watershed since 1891. He is a proud fifth-generation resident of El Dorado County. He joins us as the landowner of the Longbar property and is involved with other restoration projects in meadows in the Sierra Nevada and wetlands in the Klamath Basin. Please welcome Dale.
Hello.
Restoration projects take many years and each one is unique. There are many conversations, meetings, and discussions that occur before funding is sought. In general, the first step is to identify a need, find a location, develop enough of a project to apply for funding, begin monitoring, design, and secure permits, and finally, construction. Then there can be years of monitoring following construction and pivoting when things go awry. Starting with Aaron, can you please tell us how you define restoration from your professional background and how you measure success? And also, if I left anything out from your background, please fill us in. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, I think when I think about restoration, I kind of have two ideas or concepts in mind. One of them is trying to restore, enhance, or improve the ecosystem functions of the area that we're working with. So whether we're trying to recreate some pre-European condition, or as is frequently the case, just trying to move things towards a more natural or healthy system within the constraints of roads or bridges or whatever infrastructure kind of can't be modified. And then the other important part is thinking about what does the future look like, and what does that mean in terms of changes in hydrology and how that drives geomorphology, things like that. And sort of providing maybe the tools that system needs to do what it does naturally even better. Yeah, I think for restoration, that's kind of what I think about.
Thanks, Aaron. Kirsten, same question. How do you define, or what is restoration and how do you define success? And if I left anything out.
Sure. So I don't often use actually the term restoration because I feel like it implies this sort of return to pre-European conditions, which is not a reality for most of our project sites. And just thinking from kind of a river-centric perspective, I like to think about like reconciliation ecology. So, you know, what are the constraints that we're dealing with currently? What are the stressors on the system? And then what are our opportunities? What are our goals for the particular project? So a lot of the work that I do is really based on salmonids. So, you know, what do the salmonids that are currently able to access this river reach need in order to be more healthy, in order for the populations to increase, that kind of thing. So how can we reconcile what's here and kind of what humans still need to be able to do with what is, you know, what the resource needs and what will make it a more functional ecosystem overall. So it's always those two kind of balancing points for all of our projects. And yeah, I mean, I think it is important because of the impacts that we as humans have had on the landscape. So here in California, all of the major rivers have dams pretty low down, you know, somewhere between 70 and 90 of historical habitat for salmon is gone. I feel a personal responsibility and just like a human responsibility to contribute to making that better in the ways that we are able to do as human beings. Yeah, that's why it is important to me.
Great, I love that. I like the use of reconciliation biology. I think that it implies a different goal than the standard restoration goals. So thank you, Kirsten, for that.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, Sam, you're up. Same question. And maybe you could tell us about all the letters after your name and what they mean.
Thanks. Those letters mostly deal with my involvement in erosion and sediment control and organizations that certify people for that kind of work and that kind of further study in erosion and sediment control. I'm able to prepare a stormwater pollution prevention plan is one of the practical outcomes of those letters. I think that the question about what is restoration, what does it mean to me, was really comprehensively answered by Kirsten and Aaron. I don't think I would have too much more to add. I'd say similar to Kirsten, you know, restoration would you know, ideally mean putting something back the way it was before, and that's just not possible in a lot of systems. So dealing with the system constraints that we have, a lot of times we discuss rehabilitation, renaturalization, that kind of thing. Restoration, but in terms of restoration, what are your goals? You know, who are you trying to support? In our case, as Kirsten mentioned, we're trying to support juvenile salmonids. And what did the river pre-impact provide for those fish? And how can we get some of that back working within the constraints that we have now? That's what we're attempting to do with restoration. And to me, I mean, we're doing these projects to support endangered species and to try to bring a little more ecological balance back. So that's really important to me.
And from your engineer background, how would you define success in a project?
Success, I mean, from a very black and white kind of standpoint, did we hit our objectives? You know, what were we aiming to do at the outset, and have we gotten there? And this really kind of could lead us into a discussion on monitoring. It's really important to understand, did we succeed and how did we succeed? Because a lot of these projects are they're in dynamic systems and they're there's a little bit of experimentation going on. It's not like we're building a road or a bridge or a house, something where we know pretty much the dimensions of things and the outcome. Rivers change and they change things. So it's really important to monitor the projects and make sure that you did succeed. We like to see that we hit our design objectives, and we really like it when we say, wow, I wasn't expecting it was going to be that good. So that's when it's really successful. Yeah. And we like to see that the project is sustaining over time, that it's and that I don't mean that in the sense of a bridge, it's going to stay in place, but that it is continuing to provide ecological function and enhancements over time.
Cool. All right, thanks, Sam. Dale, do you have anything to add? What does restoration look like from a landowner's perspective, and how do you define success? And also, if you want to speak about any of the hats that you've worn, we'd love to hear it.
Dale, I'm particularly interested in how you think about success in your lower Yuba stuff, but I know you've also got projects in meadows and wetlands and a lot of different areas. And so somebody that's kind of involved in a lot of different types of projects, I'd love to hear your thoughts on success, especially.
The thing I take came from Alan Savory, who talked about simplifying it by saying, what do you want it to look like? And in the case of the meadow, we don't want it to dry out. We don't want it to be invaded by lodgepole. We want it to, function. And I'd say one of the things that I bring to this, because my family's been doing this for a long time, is the time scale. Of course, we all work under the law of unintended consequences, but our wetland restoration in the Klamath Basin, there's a water rights adjudication. It's a very messy area. Those water rights go back to the 1900s. And it turns out you get to a certain point, and in that adjudication, because we put a wetland conservation easement on our land, it's being adjudicated under Oregon water law, and Oregon water law does not recognize fish and wildlife as a beneficial use of water. So in theory, we lost all of our water rights when we put the conservation easement on it. And so the thing that I've brought, that I got mostly from my predecessors that ran the title insurance company, is that there are legal consequences that bounce literally for hundreds of years, and that getting the design from a chain of title and a legal standpoint is really important. One of the biggest issues we have on the lower Yuba, we're trying to sell. We have one piece of property we want to sell. The title company has 68 exceptions to our title, involving a myriad of lawsuits that span back to the debris commission days. And it's very difficult when you're doing a project today. You can see the problem you want to solve. It's very difficult to look ahead to what that means 50 years down the road. And a lot of the problems on the Yuba River are the result of, if I can say, the engineers that solved the engineering problem but didn't solve any of the people problems. So those things go on. Restoration is all of the challenges on the Yuba of moving all the sand and gravel, but it's what is it going to look like 100 years from now?
Yeah, thanks, Dale. Yeah, I think it's really critical to think about the time element when doing a big project like this. We like to throw the word dynamic around when we're applying for funds or when we're looking at design, because we need these projects to function throughout a variety of years in terms of water year, so a variety of flows and intensities, but also throughout a long period of time, hopefully. But with the caveat that things are unpredictable. And so how can we design a project that can move with the unpredictability? So Aaron and Sam, maybe you can speak about that.
Sure. In a lot of these projects, as Aaron mentioned, we're looking at effects of climate change, and we're already looking at the effects of altered hydrology. So we are going into this with the mindset that we need to design this with a good dose of, we always say, topographic heterogeneity, to make sure that the project functions over a range of conditions. So we're already thinking in terms of allowing for that amount of variation in flows. So that comes down to a study of hydrology for us, and more and more looking at projections of the hydrology in the future, and trying to understand how the site is going to function in the future. So on a site like Long Bar, we have a design that is looking at providing habitat enhancements that are going to occur at very low flows and up to moderate flood flows. And so over the entirety of the site, there's a variety of elevation change that goes on, and different areas where water is being directed or invited, and that's intended to make sure that when the river's running at 7,000 CFS, there's still habitat. It's not all too fast and deep, and when it's down at base flow, there's going to be good edge habitat and other areas that fish can take advantage of.
I think another challenge with this kind of engineering is this recognition that these river systems are inherently dynamic. They're going to change. And so, when Sam and, all of us talk about a project and, okay, well, when do we want water to start coming into this channel we've created, or, flowing over the floodplain, and what elevations are we going to design that at? At some level, we know that that's a dynamic state, and that we're setting it, but that the river is going to adjust it and change it. And so engineering and trying to kind of build something that is static and stable, and also know that it might change. Sam, we were talking about like the challenges of this kind of restoration or design versus a house. Imagine designing a house, but knowing that that house is going to grow, and maybe it's going to rain a lot and you're going to get another bedroom off the side. And gee, how do we design this house so that if we do get another bedroom, it's a useful bedroom and doesn't actually end up in the kitchen and destroy the kitchen, which you also want. It really creates for a very kind of challenging and interesting landscape, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing that we're thinking of is how is this design going to fare in the future? Because as Aaron mentioned, the kitchen might go away. So it's got to be able to, we're putting it on a good trajectory. Right now at the site, there's not a whole lot of potential there for fish. So we're lowering it and getting it into a place where fish can access it in a variety of flows. And if and when the river decides to move sediment around on the bar, it's still going to be in a good place. It's still going to be on a good trajectory to provide habitat into the future.
Yeah, it's super impressive that your designs allow for some movement. And I can imagine it could be quite frustrating as well to work so long on a project and then potentially see it get washed away. And so I trust that your designs are robust enough to handle some years of intensity.
Well, it could come down to the next big storm, Tyler. And we have once seen a project get completely washed away, but for the most part, we're not kidding ourselves, and we're not getting overly there's no ego in maintaining a project and having it work, having water just spill over this crest into this channel perfectly as we designed it. What we really are looking for is the outcome. What's going to happen on this site? Are the fish going to use it, and is it going to be usable well into the future?
Yeah, but I think just to kind of follow up on that a little bit, I think there is this element of kind of managing expectations too. especially for gravel augmentation projects where we're putting gravel into the river for spawning. You know, you would expect high flow events to change that, but also the salmon themselves, when they are spawning, they're moving the gravel. So there's this sort of, there's an expectation that that's going to shift over time and that gravel is going to go somewhere and need to be replenished, right? So I think, you know, making sure that everyone who's involved with the project is on board with that and understands that dynamic, especially in the rivers that we work in that don't have a source of gravel, there's always going to be this need to kind of replenish that resource so that it maintains function over time.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. From your perspective, Kirsten, how can you account for this unpredictability when setting goals for the biological community's response to restoration or reconciliation? And how do you measure the effects of that unpredictability post-restoration?
That's a really good question. we have a project on the Merced River that was completed right before the drought. So right before, you know, 2013, 2014. It was a juvenile habitat restoration project. And then for the 3 years after we built the project, our floodplain didn't inundate, right? there was not enough water. So the, you know, everything just kind of turned off and we had no inundation there. And then in 2017, we had a huge flow event that like really kind of knocked the socks off of the river. And it was very, you know, it was very functional during that time. And so, yeah, so I mean, you can't predict that, right? Like when we were building the project, we had no idea that, you know, we wouldn't be able to monitor that site for 3 years. So you have to be really flexible and kind of come into it knowing that that's a possibility and learn from that too, right? So that project was followed by the next project that we did, which was actually funded by drought restoration funding. So after that big drought, there were a couple of opportunities and we designed a project that was designed to function under a broader range of flows, basically. So that this year, we built that project out, and now we have this opportunity to measure that project because it will function even if flows are really low, even if we don't have a floodplain, you know, inundating event. So I think there is this sort of iterative learning that comes from that unpredictability too. But yeah, it's a challenge, right? Because you can't predict the weather. It's a lot like farming that way.
Yeah, super challenging and super cool to see the effects of different intensity of flows or any sort of unpredictable thing on your restoration project.
Mm-hmm.
One thing though that we do know is predictable is once we've got cooperation with a landowner, we're set. But Dale, I'm curious about what is the appropriate way for somebody to approach you when they want to use your property for restoration? Oh, Dale, we can't hear you right now. I think you're still muted.
That's a good question because different landowners probably have different ideas of where they want to go. I would say again that in the case of a lot of landowners, their goal is that they like the land the way it is. They want to preserve it. So the preservation side, and I don't, you know, recognizing that it's very, very dynamic. It's not a static preservation. And in many cases, I think my experience with most of the projects that I've done or that the Resource Conservation District has done, the landowner is aware of what they would like to see happen. And one of the major barriers for a private landowner is permitting. So bringing the ability of, you know, agencies or 501c3s to manage the complexity of the permitting. I think that in most cases, the landowners are already on board with the idea, but the prospect of doing permitting is pretty daunting to a private individual. It's, you know, I mean, you people work in a world where there are people who do it full time. So that I think is probably one of the most valuable things that the landowner can see. Maybe there's one other thing. I have noticed that there is a lack of awareness by financial advisors, estate attorneys, CPAs, about the potential tax benefits of these kinds of conservation easements and things like that. And I think that we need the conservation community has to get some of those advisors more involved. You know, tax leverage is not something that drives any of this, but making more advisors aware of opportunities would help get the message out to people who maybe don't have personal contact with someone knocking on their door and saying, "Hey, we'd like to do this project." So that's an area of education and outreach that the community really can work on.
I want to come back to that, Dale, but you mentioned permits being a hurdle. So Kirsten, just real quick, what quick ballpark of how many permits go into a single restoration project?
Oh boy, I would say about 12 usually. You know, there's the state and the federal arm of that, and then sometimes there are local county permits and things as well. Yeah, it's a big deal. You know, it's definitely a lot, and I think it's really important to have those strong relationships with the agencies. And you know, it's in some ways it's easier doing restoration permitting because usually you have a common goal with some of the permitting agencies. So it's, you know, you can kind of work hand in hand and come up with mitigation that is going to be supportive of, you know, the work that you're ultimately trying to do to protect and enhance the resource. So I think as far as permitting goes, we have a good kind of fun job because we're all kind of pushing in the same direction for the most part usually.
It's the first time I've ever heard somebody use permits and fun in the same sentence.
I was going a little overboard there.
But back to Dale's point, we are seeing a shift in at least California's administration, with Gavin Newsom stating over and over again the importance of on-the-ground restoration projects like floodplain restoration. Are you encouraged by this shift? Have you noticed a shift in maybe talking to your other fellow landowners? And are there any challenges that you're still facing? You mentioned just getting the word out, but are there any other challenges?
I have a unique perspective because resource conservation districts are all about cooperation, leverage, cooperative agreements. And, you know, we have the ability, for example, that we can do forestry projects on private land, Forest Service land, irrigation district land in the same project out of the same pool of money. I would say that my experience, and I've been doing that for 25 years, is that there's a lot more conversation about cooperation than there is activity. And the reality is that you can be, the EPA can have a lot of power, but they can't get anything done on the ground. And that's why 501c3s, for example, and RCDs have such an active role, because they cross those boundaries to do, you know, really cooperative projects. I would say with respect to permitting, the idea of programmatic permits, for example, where the permitting agencies get involved to do some of the outlines of the permits ahead of time, those are very expensive. RCDs have trouble paying for those kinds of projects. And I haven't really seen that the regulatory agencies have made as much of a commitment towards recognizing that restoration is not the same thing as a Walmart parking lot.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we've encountered on some of our projects, is, you know, trying to help work within that permitting framework to you know, yeah, just work within that framework to say this is different than construction, you know, our goals are different, than product is different. You know, yeah, we're lucky having some of those relationships because we're in a position where it's trusted, there's a known goal, and everybody's trying to figure out kind of the most efficient way to get someplace, get to a restoration project and end goal.
I have one other thing I'd add, which I heard Kirsten say, is these projects throughout the area that I work in, Northern California, typically run on personal relationships. It's the ability of people to sit down and talk to the permitting people, and they kind of have a relationship. But then every other project, none of that carries over, you know, generically.
Mm-hmm.
Every Sierra Nevada Meadow restoration project is different, but they're really all the same. The goals are the same, a lot of the techniques are the same, and yet every project has to go through this same process that if you don't have those relationships is really laborious. I mean, it takes so much time that almost all private landowners would just find it completely impossible to do.
I'll agree with Dale on relationships, especially as a lot of these projects involve work in the water. And this has to do, Tyler, with the initials after my name. You know, it takes a lot of communication on most projects that I've heard people report great success on, whether it's restoration or otherwise. You know, we completed this project in an unrealistic deadline or unrealistic time frame. It all came down to communicating with the regulation agencies and getting someone there to understand your project so that it doesn't land on their desk like the application for a Walmart parking lot. And, you know, a lot of the projects that we do that deal with tidal floodplain reconnection, we're digging channels in mud to connect them to an estuary. And from a sediment and erosion control standpoint, why should that fly? You have to explain to people, you have to really talk about ecological function and make sure that they understand what's going to happen there when the project is complete.
Or
Thanks,
in the case of Long Bar, explain to them how gravel mining is restorative.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna jump in for a second. I'm gonna encourage anybody who's watching from home, please submit some questions to us. We're happy to keep talking, but if you have something that you want an answer to, let us know. Dale and Sam, you both mentioned the importance of cooperation. Aaron, I'm wondering if you could tell us, ballpark again, how many people you think work on a project the size of Long Bar, and what agencies are missing from this panel right now? We've got biologists, engineers, landowner, but who else? Who are the other major players in a project?
Yeah, boy, there really are a lot. I think this is certainly for Long Bar, I think this is a lot of the team that we work with kind of in a day in, day out. I think a lot of the, you know, the permitting and regulatory side. So NIMFs and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are a big part of that. That we work with, and it really does feel like a collaborative process. Again, something that has come up a number of times because we have these good relationships and these very sort of functional working relationships. We're able to collaborate with them on some of the sort of the permitting and those issues. I think another big part of it that, you know, could be part of this panel is the sort of the funding mechanism, and how do you make your restoration project, you know, the diamond among many applications. You know, there's finite financial resources for these projects, and so how do you make sure that yours is the best, and demonstrating that it's the most likely for success. I think the other piece for this that is missing is the community that you're in. So many of these restoration projects that we work on together, but restoration more generally, kind of by nature, by definition, it has to happen in more rural communities because you need the space, and it's much harder to say, no, downtown, we can just tear out some of these buildings so that we can have some, build some habitat. That's not realistic. So it happens in these rural communities, and engaging more with those communities and reaching out, and listening a lot, and then trying to explain what the benefit is, what benefits and how are they going to benefit from, what is an old gravel bar, maybe, was private property at one point, that through this restorative or rejuvenative process, we can start moving towards, maybe there's now public access. Someday we can move property from private ownership to some sort of a conservation group so that there's more natural access for people in those communities. And I think that's part of our conversation that I think needs to be emphasized, that those communities are the most directly involved.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that too, I think there's an opportunity to partner with educational groups with that. I think that's where we've had the most success in bringing people to the table, is in bringing students out to the sites and having them help with planting trees and having them help with any monitoring, counting rocks, whatever. Like, a lot of those kids wouldn't necessarily even see that or understand that restoration project without that connection. And I think that can kind of help bring that educational component into the project and make it real for a lot more people.
That's a great point, Kirsten, especially in where your projects really interface with more urban areas. I know, Aaron, you're speaking about the rural areas, but where you have a project that's in an urban setting and it gets a lot of visibility, the community involvement can't be overlooked. It can be a real boon to the project and get it just great acceptance in the community, and that kind of support when you need volunteers and volunteers to help maintain or help monitor, or there's all kinds of support there in the community in a lot of cases.
Yeah, the power of citizen science should not be underestimated.
Exactly.
And it'd be really cool to incorporate more of that in any project. So we're the South Yuba River Citizens League. We work a lot on the Yuba here, but I know that the rest of you, including Aaron, have experience in other watersheds. And I'm curious to hear how the Yuba is unique and maybe what unique challenges the Yuba has in big restoration projects. And this is open to anybody, but maybe we'll hear from Kirsten first, just because you're the first person on my end.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the projects on the Yuba are unique somewhat in that they're not as accessible. So I work on the American River a lot, and that's all urban, right? So there's just a lot of people interacting with that river from the land side. But it's, because the gold fields are kind of a daunting landscape for a lot of people, I think it is a little bit more isolated. So I think that's where actually, like, this virtual stuff, having like a fly through video of, like, what does it actually look like back there, because it's really not super accessible unless you have a boat, is really important. But I think also the Yuba has a lot of opportunity because there's so much, because of the gold fields, because there's so much aggregate there. There's so much of the landscape is sort of this, like, cut off floodplain. And so it creates this opportunity to really improve, both rearing and spawning habitat with what is currently there, with what we did historically to the landscape. So I think that it's kind of neat, because you do have this really big opportunity to see a large impact to the fisheries with relatively little effort, because you're not having to kind of haul in rock and things like that. And these win-win partnerships too, right? Because there are a lot of aggregate plants there, and there's, like Dale was saying, there's not sometimes a way to access that aggregate without getting the permitting in place. So that's been really neat to see these sort of really win-win situations where we're able to partner with landowners and everybody's happy, and we're all really collaborating together in this really active way. So I think that's unique to the Yuba somewhat.
I agree with that. I think that's a big project mover, Kirsten. The ability of having a landowner that is cooperative, and we want the rocks out of the river, they want the rocks from the river. It really helps to give the project some momentum, and that's something that I've only seen on the projects that I've worked on the Yuba.
Yeah, I'll jump in and emphasize that that same project, or that same kind of idea, that collaborative win-win nature, being able to work with aggregate companies has been really great. And and it makes the restoration so much easier. And the Yuba as well is a pretty impressive watershed to start working in. I recently came to SYRCL, coming up on a year now, but was in Oregon before that, and was doing more of my research in much smaller headwater streams in Oregon and Washington, and work up there. And so to go from really small, sort of 50 to 100 CFS most of the year streams, where the goal is how much wood can we put in this river, and then kind of walk away, to go from projects that were a bit more like that, a bit less designed because the forces were just so much smaller for much of the year, to kind of intellectually knowing the history of the Yuba and the scale of the goldfields, and flying over it in Google Earth and having sort of an intellectual sense. And then I very much remember, I think it was my third day at SYRCL, Dale, I had the opportunity to go out with some of the folks at Kramer Fish Sciences to do some surveys at Long Bar, and being absolutely blown away that the piles of gold that I'd seen in the dredge piles, that I'd been familiar with. I'd done some work in Eastern Oregon. We've got dredge piles out there, like I kind of knew. And to sort of be order of magnitude off in what I had envisioned was really striking, and made the Yuba and the lower Yuba especially a really kind of unique set of challenges. And also to be fortunate enough to step into the Hallwood project and watch it happening, and sort of go from, okay, this is what you're going for, but look, it can be done. For me, it was a very sort of unique and powerful experience stepping into this restoration role.
I think it's probably helpful for a lot of people listening who aren't as familiar with the Yuba to really put a point on what we mean when we say getting the rocks out of the river, because it kind of sounds like, why would you want to do that? But as Aaron just mentioned, there are massive training walls. The whole lower Yuba channel has been moved and channelized by dredger tailing piles that are over 100 feet tall. And on that Hallwood project, there were big piles of dredger tailings in the middle of the channel that were over 100 feet tall. So getting those out has allowed us to really dramatically lower the floodplain there, and to provide a lot of off main channel rearing habitat.
To help emphasize, I just realized that I've got a photo of this that I can change to. So this is, Dale, you might recognize this. This is part of Long Bar. And so these are these piles that we're talking about, and this is all dredged pilings here, kind of above my head a little bit, and those piles are 60 to 100 feet tall, of sort of golf ball to basketball sized gravels and cobbles.
And Aaron, what would the river have looked like before the gold rush?
Best guess. In some ways, that's kind of hard to tell. We have records, and everything that I'm gonna say and sort of postulate about and make estimates about is somewhat shaped by this Eurocentric narrative of what this world looked like, or what the Western U.S. looked like. So I would caveat that say we don't know exactly, but my guess is that we would have a series of a couple of main channels and probably a series of smaller channels that connected in sort of a braided pattern. Lots of willow, but probably lots of larger wood, cottonwood, both standing on kind of small and very large islands, and a lot of it in the river itself. And then at high water, if early records of the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which is a broadly similar size watershed, at high water, floodplain that was maybe a mile wide, potentially, when you see really high, that sort of flood that maybe we only see every 5 to 10 years could probably flood the valley a mile wide. And so the whole thing is water. And then as that water drops, who knows what the river's going to look like. The channels moved left or right, meters, half a mile, woods moved, there's new wood in places. So very, very dynamic, changing every 5 to 10 years would be my guess.
There are property records on the lower Yuba River that if you ask what did it look like 100 years ago, what it looked like was about 5 miles away. I mean, that again, a braided river channel is never going to be stable. And in fact, I don't know how old Aaron's picture of the training walls is, but was it 2017 that we had the really high water?
Yep.
I can tell you there's not nearly as much of those walls there now as there was before that high water event. And that goes back
that
to
was a big deal.
That goes back
Sorry,
to the issue that you can do the Hallwood project and the long bar may come down and bury it for you again.
Yeah.
Right in the middle of the long bar property. And this goes back to who should be, in this discussion is the BLM, because the BLM has a dispute about ownership and the eventual desire to do a restoration of the long bar project, involves the fact that there's 100-foot high of gravel, 100-foot high pile of gravel right in the middle of the bar. And, I think the project you're talking about involves removing a roughly 300,000 cubic yards of material.
Yeah, the lower section, that's about what we're looking at. Yeah.
That's a fraction of what would be on that 5-acre piece. But if you have to pay someone to move that one truckload at a time, that's pretty expensive.
Yeah.
Again, all of these things, there's a regulatory framework. The Yuba Water Agency has restoration projects that have timelines attached to them. And moving 3 million cubic yards of gravel, you're not going to get that done in 5 or 10 years. I mean, even if you start today, it's going to take a while to move that much material.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sam, Aaron, and Dale for painting the picture of the Yuba for us. But Kirsten, why is a 100-foot wall of gravel bad for the river from a biological perspective?
I'm glad you asked. So, I mean, salmon centric, right? Like a lot of our projects are really focused on salmon. But really salmon are keystone species for the riparian ecosystem. And so, under the sort of natural braided condition, you'd see these big flood up events and there'd be, thousands and thousands of acres for the juvenile salmon that are in the river during the wet season to rear. And so they really need these habitats to be inundated in order to have a place to live, in order to have a productive prey community where they can grow. And the shallow, like having the river shallow up can make the water warmer, which contributes to their faster growth rates. And so when you have the river kind of looking like this with steep banks on either side, they just don't have that at all. They don't have that sort of velocity refuge. They don't have a place to get away from predators. So that's really what we're trying to do with a lot of these projects, is just pulling the tailings down so that we can get inundation every year for a certain period of time. So the juvenile salmon that are in the river have a way to get away from that main channel and to these off-channel habitats that are more productive for them. which is more similar to what, what they evolved under, the conditions that they evolved under, like Aaron was describing.
So what kind of effect would you expect this big restoration project to have on the salmon community?
A large effect, right? I mean, I think the Yuba in particular, there is actually quite a bit of spawning habitat in the Yuba in the main part of the river, but there's very little rearing habitat. And so these little fish, they come out of the gravel, they're super tiny and vulnerable, and they kind of just get washed down for the most part. And so by creating these huge expanses, so the Hallwood project that we were talking about earlier it's like 160 acres of floodplain. It's a ton of habitat, right? And then the Long Bar project too. Sam, do you know? I'm trying to remember the acreage. I mean, I think
it's more like 40 acres.
Yeah. So you have these huge expansive areas. They can really support, billions of babies. So, and then some of those babies aren't going to make it, right? They go down the Sacramento into the estuary, but that's why salmon have so many babies. And if we can create the situation where they're rearing longer, they're growing bigger before they get down into the estuary, there's evidence that they will survive. Their survival rate will be much higher as they're moving through those, predator infested systems, and that they'll be able to come back. So ultimately, we're sort of supporting a larger salmon population. So that's kind of the idea.
I wanted to add something also, Tyler, about removing gravel and lowering the bars. And we're talking a lot about, maybe we haven't specifically said it, but depth and velocity, suitability for rearing salmonids. But another thing that it does is, well, this is kind of taking a step back into history, but when all the 300+ million cubic yards of sediment washed down from the hills during the gold mining era, it created a higher channel, a higher bed in the river. And now that the river's carving its way out, it's been relocated, a lot of those bars are too high. So taking down the bars, taking down the gravel piles is going to not only communicate flows to the floodplain for the salmonids, but also we're hoping to see over time more recruitment of vegetation so that we get back to that full riparian community that Aaron was describing, where we have some larger trees growing in the river and providing cover for the juvenile fish as well.
So Sam, are you telling me that by doing these, we're kind of tipping the scales and the river will continue to recover itself and start unearthing more of its floodplain habitat?
That's the direction we're headed. Like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to put these sites that we restore on a trajectory for success. So we're trying to develop the appropriate hydraulic habitats, depth and velocity, and also cover. We're hoping for vegetation recruitment. We've now gotten the surface of the bar closer to the groundwater, and so the plants can survive there.
I think one of the other things that this does, because we kind of thinking about sort of an ecosystem in the full food chain, is our focus and kind of the drive, like Kirsten said, is the salmonids and these endangered and threatened species. And we talk a lot about lowering floodplain and floodplain connectivity and plant growth. And the link between those is bugs, essentially, is the micro and macro invertebrates that the juvenile salmon eat. And so when we've got more vegetation closer to the river that's healthier and more vigorous, that's where the food, the juvenile salmon food, lives. And so if we have more of that habitat as well, there's more food for the juvenile salmon. They get to grow larger and stronger as they're in these backwaters and the sort of side channels that we construct. And then when they ultimately move out to the ocean, because they're bigger, because they're stronger, because they've had more food, they're more likely to come back. And that's, when we think about this process, it's easy as a geomorphologist, I think about moving the rocks and how big are the rocks as an engineer. Sam's very much the same way, but it's, the bugs, and it's the small life that is really kind of tying these two worlds together in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so we're creating these physical conditions that will support that, and with the ultimate goal being that, you know, it gets to the baby sand. And so that's a lot of what we do with our monitoring too, is, you know, we try to kind of assess the conditions before we do a restoration project, but then really we're looking at how all of these different layers of the ecosystem are responding. So primary productivity, so like, you know, yeah, are we getting riparian tree recruitment? And then down to like the invertebrates. What are the invertebrates that are colonizing these spaces? You know, are we seeing higher invertebrate densities after we do the restoration? And then ultimately, are we getting more fish, and are they growing faster? And so those are like the questions that are really fun, because you can kind of really start to see that you're meeting these restoration goals in a firsthand.
Yeah, and certainly the effects must cascade outside of just the river, right? Like if we're recruiting trees, then we must have birds also colonizing the area, and especially those that might be feeding on the juvenile salmon, and you start to create this ecosystem-wide effect, which I think is really cool. Now we only have a few minutes left, and so I'd like to give each of you 1 minute to tell me your favorite thing about working in restoration, or maybe the most rewarding thing about working on these projects. Dale, we'll start with you.
I just like natural habitats. I like things that I have enough experience, and I've spent enough time out there that I like environments that work. And one of the most enjoyable things I ever did was to turn 600 acres of barley field back into a seasonal marsh. So that's the real thrill for me. The joke is my family sort of specializes in edible wildlife, but people ask, you know, how do you know that your restoration worked? And in the case of waterfowl, it was easy. You drive out and there's 10,000 ducks out there. It's pretty obvious that you did something that they like.
Awesome. Thanks, Dale. Aaron, your favorite thing about working in restoration?
Boy, I think my guess is there's going to be a lot of similar answers. I think for me, it's the same thing. This idea of creating and trying to help the environment sort of heal in some ways and move forward, move to more healthier, sort of more sustainable ecosystem. One of the big, for me, one of the kind of key moments or images in my head, especially in the lower Yuba, is the Hallwood project, which we've kind of mentioned a couple of times, and going out there at the beginning of summer prior to construction and seeing the piles of gravel preventing the river, very much locking the river in place. And through the course of the summer, they're moving, you know, 1 million cubic yards of material, I think was what they moved this summer. And at the end of the project, sort of as we were wrapping up in the spring and they dug new channels, you know, there was still equipment on the bar moving, and there were Chinook building reds, and the willows that we had planted a week and a half ago were starting to take root, and we were seeing new leaves. And so for me, it's that idea that nature is far more resilient than I think I remember sometimes, and that it doesn't need much. It just needs a little opportunity and that sort of recognition that it has value, and it's gonna kind of repair and help itself, but it needs that little nudge. And so for me, that's the most rewarding part, is this idea that if I can help kind of push something back into a little bit more natural and a little bit more sustainable place, that's all it needs. That's all I have to do, is just open the door a little bit.
Thanks, Aaron. Sam, could you quickly tell us your favorite thing about working in restoration?
Yeah, it's quite similar. I have come from however, a harder civil engineering background, and a lot of my earlier projects were things like housing developments and making things work for humans and creating hardscapes and, you know, that kind of thing. So now to be able to turn my efforts toward opening things up to nature and trying to get ecological function back into the landscape. Especially rewarding for me is when this happens in conjunction with another project that's, say, a levee revetment project where we're adding habitat elements, or an urban creek where we're setting back some banks and providing a park that people can enjoy. They can start to learn about ecological function, and then it starts to make sense to them that this ditch that was running through their neighborhood, it actually does something. It's, you know, it's providing a lot of habitat for all kinds of different species. And so to share that kind of excitement, that understanding about ecology and what the landscape is capable of with everybody, and having that be part of my day-to-day work is really rewarding.
Thanks, Sam. All right, Kirsten, close us out.
All right.
What's your favorite thing?
Two things. So I'll be really quick. So so restoration ecology is a pretty young science still. And for me, I think like the iterative learning process that we go through when we're doing the monitoring work related to these projects is really rewarding. You know, we can take something that we learn, a lesson that we learned from one project, and apply it to the next project and really make a better project the next time around, and really kind of get better at it as we go. I think that's what keeps me really motivated and really excited for the day-to-day work that I do. And then I have 4 kids, so for me, like, feeling like every day I'm doing something that's improving the world and improving the world that my kids are going to inherit is really something that keeps me happy and keeps me feeling really satisfied about the work that I do. And in general, the people that I work with too, right? All of you guys, like, I think it's fun to work with folks that are, you know, all on the same page, all kind of pushing in the same direction, but also being able to bring in a range of folks, a range of stakeholders, and, you know, kind of get behind the same goals is really satisfying.
I totally agree. Well, thank you everybody from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do to restore rivers. And thank you for joining us today on this panel. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, everybody.